small island developing states, including the British Overseas Territories. As the Minister of Sustainability, Innovation and the Environment, she holds a pivotal role in shaping policies related to agriculture, fisheries, information technology, environmental conservation, renewable energy development, and statistical analysis. Next is Ms. Cheryl Senhouse, Finance Innovation Director, the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, CCSA. In the role of Finance Innovation Director with the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, Cheryl holds responsibility for the fundraising, climate finance solutions, financial management, financial management, administration, and technology portfolios. She's an experienced strategy and finance leader who has managed operations across several industries and sectors over the last 20 years. Stephen O'Driscoll is Head of Environment, Climate and Social Policy with the European Investment Bank, EIB. Stephen joined the EIB in 2008, having previously worked in private consultancy in the UK and elsewhere in the world. Previously the Head of Aviation, Maritime and Innovative Transport, Stephen's role was to make sure that the projects the bank financed in these sectors were technically, economically, and environmentally viable. Isaac Solomon is the Vice President of Operations with the Caribbean Development Bank, CDB. Mr. Isaac Solomon is the Vice President Operations at the Caribbean Development Bank. In that position, he provides leadership and direction to the economic and project departments. He's responsible for corporate planning and CDB's lending and related economic activity. He spearheads the bank's engagement with its borrowing members and development partners. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased that this distinguished panel could be here this afternoon. And from the perspective of the OECS, we recently had our needs-based finance assessment for climate change adopted by our ministers. We recognize the need for innovative approaches because some of the traditional approaches have not worked. And so we really look forward to having this panel, which we've organized together with the CDB. And at this time, to get things moving, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Valerie Isaac of the Caribbean Development Bank. So, Valerie, you all set?
Thank you, Crispin. And I think before we actually start the moderation, there's a 3-minute video to be displayed.
In the Caribbean, there is real-time evidence of how global warming is impacting our world. In a little over a decade, close to 10 million people have been displaced by natural disasters that continue to escalate in ferocity.
Once you're at a point of crisis and you realize the threat is big, you realize something has to be done. We can either run away from a big challenge or we can decide to solve it. And because we're an institution that's in the business of solving problems, I think for CDB, failure is not an option.
The Caribbean Development Bank is central to the region's climate fight, supporting its borrowing member countries, governments, and partners in public and private sectors. The institution is dedicated to supporting the construction of climate-resilient infrastructure, enhancing energy efficiency, preserving water resources, and restoring biodiversity through the protection of coral reefs.
Something has to change. Urgency is there. People know that their lives are being affected and their livelihoods are being affected. And so I think at an administrative level, governments are starting to realize there's no time to waste.
With the support from universities and cutting-edge data, the institution is blending climate risk assessments into investment projects. The aim? To embed climate resilience as a standard component of the region's major infrastructure, the backbone of CDB's commitment to climate-positive development.
Some interventions might have a specific climate focus, such as this Jamaica community level project, and others are bigger capital projects that are designed with a climate lens in mind. And so the climate considerations are interjected at different levels, even through our technical assistance projects, where we are looking at developing sector policies that address climate change, and national programs and investment programs that focus on climate resilience interventions.
For the Caribbean Development Bank, the road to climate response and recovery is well underway, because it is abundantly clear the price of inaction now would leave an incalculable legacy cost.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for those who are able to stay with us. I think we all understand and agree that the amount of at least the amount of finance that is needed to address the climate situation or the needs of the Caribbean region pale in comparison to what the islands have been able to access. And we all know that without the adequate and affordable financing, it will be difficult for the region to meet the outcomes stated in many of their policy documents, NDCs, etc., to address the climate crisis. So as Crispin has already introduced our panel, and we are going to have, I will ask the panel a few questions, and I will also ask the panel to respond to responses provided by some of the other panelists, so we have a bit of a dialogue going on. So I want to begin with you, Minister Gums-Marie from Anguilla. And Minister, could you give us some indication of some of the most significant finance-related barriers in Anguilla that are really inhibiting both public sector and private sector investment for climate action?
Thank you for that question, and good day to those who may have been new in the room. Again, my name is Quincy Gums-Marie, Minister from Anguilla. When it comes to the barriers that stand between us and climate finance, those of you who were here at the previous session may hear a little bit of repetition, but for the benefit of those who newly entered the room, we are British Overseas Territory that is newly responding to the crisis of Brexit. I think we have to call it now, the consequence of Brexit on climate change. And it's really good to share this stage with a representative from the EIB, because I'm going to be posing a challenge to you, or two, on behalf of all of the overseas territories. The primary matter that stands between us and climate change, I like to summarize it with 3 points: access, availability, and relevancy. Access being very closely aligned to our constitutional identity as overseas territory, and it makes it very difficult for our regional institutions such as the CDB, CARICOM, OECS, to do the job and the mandate of these organizations, which is to support these countries through whatever crises, and one of the most primary ones being climate change. So when these organizations access funds for distribution throughout the region, we are ordinarily limited from accessing these funds because of our overseas territory status. So if they're EDF and other grant financing and concessional financing, we cannot access it simply on the basis that we are overseas territories. and it completely ignores that we are equally in the clutches of climate change and experiences the consequences of such. Uh, Accessibility is also an issue. Where it is accessible, we find ourselves in many different scenarios. So one of them being, for particularly when it comes to loans, where other independent countries can decide themselves that they would increase their debt burden to respond to climate change, the overseas territories would have to have, in Angola's case in particular, would have to write to the UK to apply for the ability to apply for more debt because our debt has already exceeded what it should be based on the ratios. And if they would say that you cannot take on more debt, our climate response and in relation to taking loans to respond to debt would be severely limited. And so even though loans may be accessible on paper, we have systems that would prohibit us from accessing them. There's also the issue of what I mentioned previously, where there's a high level of expectation of governance requirements are associated with these financing streams that put us in a position that highlights our capacity restrictions, and as a result, we cannot access these finances because our limited public service cannot divert enough time to apply for these loans or concessional grants. And then there's also relevancy, which is one of the ones that I think stands out the most, particularly in this conversation. Where financing is accessible and available, we do have a problem very often with relevancy, where many of the funding institutions try to tell the region what our priorities should be. And the individual countries look at our priorities and say, we have to try to squeeze our priorities into something that sounds very closely aligned to that, but we don't have the ability to say, these are our priorities, this is how we have the funding. And when we have that ability, we mess up because we can't access it, or it's not available. So we kind of go through a cycle of barriers that should really be properly addressed. And I think what is most concerning as well is where we can access financing as overseas territories, it is often conservation financing. And while conservation is important, it really begs the question, if these countries in the region can access conservation financing, does it really change their ability or put them in a better place to respond to the climate crisis? Which is often no, because the financing that we need is development finance. We need to be able to build resilient infrastructures to empower our public service and our people to meet educational expectations so that our people can understand the climate change but also have the ability to find jobs in our climate response. And these are not seen as priorities by many funding institutions. But I mean, luckily, that's not the reality with CDB. But then it goes back again to accessibility. Can we always access the funds available and provided by the CDB? So it is a very frustrating cycle of exclusion when it comes to trying to find trying to access financing for the overseas territories. And I can only speak of the overseas territories when I speak because we have such limited representation that if I speak about the region, somebody else will tell you their reality and that'll be fine. But we are often excluded from the general conversation, even regionally. So forgive me for taking an OT-focused response to all of these questions. But it is important to recognize, as I said earlier, in the global response to the global climate crisis, we must recognize that all countries that exist on this earth should be provided for. And we shouldn't be treating these overseas territories as though we reside on Mars. Our reality is very much where, since Brexit, and that's why I mentioned the EU, we don't have access to a lot of the opportunities that we previously had access to. And we realize that even where the UK provides funding to the CDB, to OECS, to CARICOM, it doesn't include the overseas territories as well. And so we are isolated as islands. We are geographically isolated, and our experiences are isolated. So the barriers are, in my opinion, are not insurmountable. What I failed to mention in my previous presentation is that we need to get to the point of creating a global funding mechanism that supersedes all of these levels of unnecessary bureaucracy. And it's only until we get to that point that we can really position our regional funding institutions, such as the CDB, to really complete its mandate and fulfill its mandate and provide for the associated countries that are part of it.
Thank you, Minister Gums. You know, some of the issues you've identified are not unique to Anguilla, but Anguilla's situation is unique, right? So you would have many of the other islands speaking about accessing finance and some of the challenges there and the absorptive capacity on that. But thank you for that perspective. We heard earlier on the clarion cry of all the OTs. So I want to turn to Ms. Cheryl Senhouse from the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator. We have just heard Anguilla's perspective on financial barriers for investment. Could you briefly comment and tell us whether this is aligned with the perspectives of the CCSA? What do you see in your operations? Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. And I would wholeheartedly agree and co-sign what Minister Gums has said. It applies at the level of countries within our coalition, and it also applies to players in the markets and economies within those countries. So at the CCSA, we represent a coalition of 28 countries across the Caribbean and Central and South America, and we work with both the private and public sector to build a pipeline of projects, as well as building a pipeline of funders with a view to connecting those two groups of players together to mobilize capital. So we're not a traditional accelerator in that we don't provide funding, but we certainly see it as our role to be a key player in mobilizing capital into the region. We work with regional funders as well as international funders, both on the public and private side. And we also work with philanthropies where relevant to also provide support to projects within our pipeline. What we have found is that certainly the way you've summarized it, Minister Gums Marie, really is quite accurate and reflective of our experience as well. There's the issue of availability, there's the issue of access, and then there is the issue of relevance. We have kind of pivoted the work that we do to address this, and we now refer to what the region needs as fit-for-purpose funding. And that is funding that meets the region where it's at, as you would have mentioned in a previous presentation, because what we find both for sovereign level projects as well as projects emanating from climate entrepreneurs is that where projects are is not necessarily where funders may need them to be, based on the criteria they have set out for making investments into projects based particularly on returns that they expect to get. We see where there is a perspective that within the region, projects carry high risk and they expect a premium for that risk. We also see that across our countries, projects that emanate from existing organizations may be better able to access funding simply because of the relationships that those entities already have in the financial services sector. So they would already have a relationship with the banker, with some group of investors, with shareholders, may be able to access lines of credit to get businesses or ideas that they may have outside of their core operations up and running. Or if they're looking to take on, for instance, build out resilience by changing the way they operate, including renewable energy technologies, for instance, in their operations to be more efficient, they're able to access funding to make those changes simply because they have existing business relationships. Where you have, though, an entrepreneur who has an idea to combat climate change, who may be new to the market, the microeconomy as a player, their ability to translate their ideas into a commercial enterprise that can then access funding that generates a return for their investor, their ability to do that is quite different from an existing business. And we need to be able to provide support both with preparation, through technical assistance, through studies, feasibility studies, and just generally incubation of the ideas, navigating the business space to turn what may be a great concept and a great idea into a viable and scalable, in a lot of instances, commercial opportunity. So certainly our experience does match what Minister Gums has said, and we are working within our coalition as well as with our partners to be able to address some of those challenges.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I want to stay with you for a little bit because the brokering service that you mentioned that some of your partners do is quite relevant to the needs, not just for the OTs, but across the rest of the region. And it may provide an opportunity for Anguilla and the other OTs to, to access some funding. But as I said, staying with you for a little bit, we know that the CCSA places a strong emphasis on promoting innovation. That is always a word widely used, bandied around, sometimes not sure what different people mean by it, but that is a core to your raison d'etre. And so you look at promoting innovation to scale up climate action in the Caribbean. Could you tell us what are some, maybe 2 or 3 innovative approaches that CCSA has particularly, you're eager to promote, and what could or should, sorry, it's a 2-part question, but what could Caribbean policymakers do to help foster or incentivize the adoption of such innovative approaches? Thanks.
So as I mentioned, we are trying to address the challenges that we have found. We've had to pivot our approach since our inception to be able to meet the needs of our stakeholders. So we would have found, as I said, that projects need considerable support in being able to move from idea to implementation. Over our, say, 3-year existence, we have scoped at least 300 projects through a variety of calls for projects for many of our financial initiatives that we have had. And recognizing the challenge, we are going about the process starting next calendar year of building out an innovation fund. And this is aimed at providing catalytic grant capital to help projects move along that pathway that we would have discussed. So providing very early stage support beyond what even many of the funders who categorize themselves as early stage funders are able to do, to be able to help projects get off the ground and to be able to then access the next stage of financing for their initiatives. We're looking at, as I said, providing that as grants and aligning with other partners who will then be able to fund the next step for those initiatives so that they can expand within our markets and really address the challenges of climate change as we see them in our markets. As I mentioned, fit for purpose is very important for us. Sometimes even in terms of ticket size for projects. There are many investors out there who will tell you that raising $1 million in funding is more expensive than raising 50 million, simply because the same level of due diligence that's required for the 50 million investment is required for the $1 million investment. So we recognize that there have to be supporting mechanisms that allow projects as well to be able for the size of projects that emanate from in our economies to be able to access funding. There has to be a pathway created for those. So what we're looking at is the Innovation Fund as a starting point, and that while the Innovation Fund will be focused on multiple sectors, we are also looking at a blended finance fund to support renewable energy implementation within the region. We have, with the support of CDB, been able to complete a design consultancy for that fund, which was born out of the Caribbean Renewable Energy Forum in 2019. That amazing idea was conceptualized to really address a funding gap within the region at the time, which is funding to help our region's countries and economies meet their goals with regard to the implementation of renewable energy. And it was determined at that time that the biggest barrier to doing that was the accessibility of funding. Blended finance, as we know, provides the opportunity for multiple players in the financial markets to come together to lower the cost of capital for the ultimate recipient and to also provide, as I said, supporting financial services that de-risk the project so that the private players are able to access market returns while the role of public funding and the role of philanthropy fills the gap and bears first losses and provides guarantees to those commercial investors. Our intended equity fund is going to be in the range of in excess of 200 million US dollars, with a view to providing equity financing and not debt funding, because we've also recognized that debt funding is very easily available, but many projects at the very early stage are not able to provide guarantees on cash flows required to access debt funding. So we're focused on equity, also with a component of supporting the development of our capital markets within the region by providing other opportunities and other pathways for other types of funding opportunities within the Caribbean. So we're focused on those two innovations in terms of financial innovation to allow us to mobilize more capital into the region. So one, catalytic grant funding, and while there are lots of grant opportunities, you will still find that in a lot of instances, even projects trying to access grants are not necessarily able to demonstrate the type of impact that is required by grant holders. So we want to provide that support. And I'll also mention that the blended finance fund that we intend to mobilize will also have a technical assistance and monitoring facility that will also help with the incubation and preparation of the projects that are seeking to access funding from that fund.
Yeah. Thank you, Cheryl, for providing us with an overview of the good work that you're doing. In fact, up to yesterday in one of the sessions with the Inter-American Development Bank, mention was made of the several project preparation funds and the various funds to support that sort of catalytic role. So it would really be important. I know you talked about doing the catalytic work and then next step, engage with partners. But it seems like we need to engage the partners from the beginning, so everybody's on the same. So thank you very much for that. I want to shift a little bit to you, Stephen. What are your views on the innovative approaches mentioned by Cheryl a while ago? Based on your experience in the region, do you think these are feasible and realistic?
Hi, Valerie. Just let me start by saying how pleased we are to be here. Very proud of our record in the Caribbean. Been working there for the last 30, 40 years, and so glad to share our views here today. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what you say there. The devil is always in the detail, of course, but in principle, I think a lot of what you said there chimes with the kind of experience that we have in the region. Blended finance, in particular, it's an often term used, but it's such an important thing, and certainly some of the programs that we're rolling out in the Caribbean now rely on blended finance to make them work. So we're actually quite lucky that we have access to EC grants to actually make that blended finance work. But it's certainly an important thing to kind of de-risk and attract other financial sources and capital flows in, that's for sure. Partnerships is so key as well. We set up our global branch start of last year, and we just cannot do that without good, solid and workable partnerships around the world. So that is absolutely key. I'm just thinking about some of the partnerships we've set up in connection with our increased involvement in the adaptation market as well, such as the Global Centre for Adaptation, through which we have access to a lot of knowledge that we wouldn't otherwise do, such as our partnership with Copernicus, which is the early warning weather system set up in Europe. So this is about making sure that we can provide data to our clients to make sure that any projects that they develop are properly aware of risks and can set themselves up as being climate resilient, which is something that we ask of our projects. So innovation, of course, climate development and innovation cannot be separated. You have to, innovation is key. We look at different risk structures, venture debt, some of the early stage financing to bring out some of the potential in projects. So we're involved in the Innovation Fund in the Commission. So all of these words that you refer to there are so salient and so important. Creativity is key. You need to be creative. You need to be constantly pushing the boundaries. When you listen to some of our other MDB partners, they're doing the same. And there's a lot of discussion in the MDB community about access, affordability, and relevance. And creativity, I think, lies at the heart of that. So it's really inspiring what you say there, but we'd like to know more. That would be very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stephen. There's a lot for the region to learn from your experiences. And as you said, sometimes you just need to tailor to the appropriate circumstances. We know I'm going to stick with the MDBs for a little bit and you, Stephen, but we know sometimes making change at MDBs, as a friend of mine would say, is like pushing molasses up a hill. But we know better than that, right?
We do.
So, Stephen, EIB is one of the world's largest MDBs, and as I mentioned, you have had considerable experience supporting climate action. What can or should MDBs do differently or better to scale up the climate action among MDBs, or even as a group and individually, just to ensure that climate finance flows to vulnerable regions like the Caribbean are more effective?
Yeah. I think actually what we've done as the EIB group over the last 3 or 4 years really does serve as a good example, I think, of what the MDB community should be doing going forward. There's a huge amount of talk this week here about working together better as a system. That is really, really key. And this really lies behind the country, well, they're being called various things, but the country platforms, which you're aware of, Valerie, and we're all hoping to play a part in. And this is about working in country alongside governments, helping them to think about policy and strategy and making sure that that is then linked to proper project planning and development of project pipelines that are actually credible. And you touched on earlier actually about the technical assistance. So getting that in place right up front, that's really key. And we're seeing more demand for that, which is actually at the heart of the proposal for a long-term strategy support facility actually set up by the MDBs as well, where we will actually, under a trust fund managed by the World Bank, the Climate Support Facility Trust Fund, we'll actually go in and sit alongside governments through that funding from donors and essentially help them develop their 30-year planning into which the NDCs fit. And trickle that down into investment pipelines and at regional and even sectoral levels so that the thing is fully coherent. But just in terms of making clear commitments, I think is so key, and having good, strong ambition. I mean, just thinking about the journey we've been on over the last 3 or 4 years, we transformed ourselves into the EU Climate Bank And with that came, some big headline commitments. One was to stop financing fossil fuels, and we were the first MDB to do that, and we did that in 2019, and we've not done that since. We've been very clear about it. The other was that we said that 50% at least of our financing by 2025 would be dedicated to climate action, environmental sustainability, which is what we call green, so that's our green finance. And last year we reached 58%, so we're already kind of 2 or 3 years ahead of our target. We promised to support 1 trillion of investment in this critical decade ahead, and we're well on track for that. And the kind of third final commitment, and it was about making strong commitments, so that you can set yourself up and your governance systems and your processes to actually honor those commitments, was about making sure that everything that we did was Paris aligned, and we gave ourselves the end of 2021 to make sure that happened. And we set up a very clear framework, a black and white framework about what we could and couldn't support, depending on whether we thought those particular projects were on a low carbon pathway and climate resilient. And I'm very proud to say that that framework is up and running, and we're very pleased with the way it's working. The other transformation we did was, as I said earlier, set up EIB Global, and that's given us a really good and sharp focus on operations outside the Union. And we actually financed 10 billion of operations outside the Union last year. But it's not just about volumes, it's about being impactful as well. And for the Caribbean in particular, that's obviously a lot to do with adaptation and resilience and disaster risk management. And we developed a very clear adaptation plan, and we're pleased to say that that's working. There's a lot more to do in adaptation terms, but we're getting there. Just transition, just resilience is crucial, because I suspect the social tipping points are probably closer than most think, and they're probably going to happen before some of the environmental and climate tipping points as well. So just resilience is actually a kind of novel idea that we've had that we're launching here at COP, which is about making sure that those impacted by adaptation policies are properly looked after, because they tend to be the most vulnerable as well. So it's not just about mitigation, it's about adaptation. I mentioned earlier the programmatic approach. So that's about working with blended finance, and we have 2 rolling out soon. The Craft Fund, of course, people may be aware of. This is the first private sector fund dedicated to innovative technologies around adaptation and resilience, and that's working well. We've extended loan tenors and maturities in the Caribbean as well. So 30-year lending, potentially in 10-year grace periods. Climate resilient debt clauses, we're starting next year. So this will give potentially some communities in the Caribbean a bit of debt deferral, which I think is terribly important. And we're actually just, in creative terms, looking at our first Debt for Nature swap deal in Barbados. So we're constantly looking at fresh ways to do things. This is about being nimble. It's not always easy when, every week is an exam week in this subject. ESG fatigue is a bit of an issue, I think, so we need to address that. But it's about staying sharp as you can and trying to have an impact.
Thank you very much, Stephen. 3 things I want to just resonate with me. This morning, we were in the session at Barbados where they spoke about the Debt for Nature for Climate swap and talked about the innovative approach that you use, or the MDBs use, to make it happen. So the other thing I want to highlight from your insights were the recognition that is a long-term strategy that's needed when you engage with the countries, and that programmatic approach fits within that, because the whole capacity issue is not static, right? So looking at it long-term is important. And the other thing I want to say before I go to the other MDB on the chair is that you talked about the climate commitments that EIB made, but it's not you didn't just make the commitments, but you are deliberate and in ensuring that you achieve those targets that you've set, and that from what you've told us, you have the evidence, and it's credible and verifiable that you are working on achieving results. So thanks Thank you for that. And for some reason, my computer has decided, sorry, for some reason my computer has gone black. So I'm just going to, let me just, okay, yeah, I was able to get that back. So, Isaac, I just want to get another perspective from you on the role of MDBs. Um, this, do you have, or would you like to add anything to what was offered by EIB, what Stephen just mentioned? In other words, how could CDB enhance or, their support to the region?
Thank you very much, Valerie, and good afternoon, everyone. I know we are co-hosting this event with the OECS, but I'm delighted to be sharing the platform with Minister Gubbs and our partners from the Climate Accelerator and EIB. So I agree wholeheartedly with what I've heard so far, and I think the narrative is the same. And a lot of the stuff that Stephen spoke about, we actually do a lot of collaboration with EIB. Actually, there is a saying in the bank that EIB is our big brother, not being gender biased here, but it speaks to the strength of the relationship we have with EIB. So I just wanted to add a few things. So as we are speaking about innovation, I really like to look at these things end to end. And so my response, I'm going to recognize the multimodal arrangement of getting funding into the region and the fact that there are several agencies, including the MDBs, who then need to channel those funds to countries and to beneficiaries. So I'm going to take it from that end-to-end perspective. So I think one of the things as MDBs that we have to do is to strengthen our collaboration. That is key. Why we need to strengthen our collaboration is simply because of the context in which we are operating. If you look at the global situation, all of the MDBs agree that the needs, the climate finance needs, surpass our balance sheets by far. And so we cannot do it alone. But we need to collaborate and collaborate in a way where we could bring additionality to each other based on our comparative advantages. So, and that collaboration takes place at several levels. And I have to say that there is one institution, FIX, that has all of the public MDBs across the world collaborating in knowledge sharing and trying to ensure that we come up with common solutions to treat with this issue. So I think collaboration is key. It is one of the things that we definitely have to ramp up and do differently than we were doing before if we have to be innovative. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, well, you mentioned one of them, Valerie, and Stephen mentioned it in terms of the debt for climate swaps. We have to get into the innovative instrument space. And I know that the Prime Minister Motley has been a champion for the contingent debt clauses. That is something that we have to fast track. It is something that we need to embrace fully to ensure that our own vulnerabilities can be taken into consideration and that we have the framework for responding whenever we are affected by a natural hazard event. We certainly need to learn and borrow from the experience with EIB in terms of the arrangement with Barbados on the debt for nature swap. I was at the same session with Valerie this morning, and the fact that they are able to bring forward savings that you can get from the swap to pay for the climate intervention, so it essentially becomes a grant, is something that I think is very appealing to all of our countries that are equally vulnerable. One of the things we have done to Valerie is in the area of advocacy. We have been on the global stage advocating for the way finance flow to the region. And my colleagues have spoken about this in terms of the access to finance. Cheryl mentioned fit-for-purpose finance. Minister Gums spoke about the access, the relevance. At CDB, we say that it is access to adequate and affordable financing. We call it hashtag AAAF. But essentially, we're saying the same thing. And one of the ways in which we have advocated for that is to champion what we call an MVI plus instrument. And what that MVI plus instrument does is to take into consideration that we are all vulnerable regardless of our income status. And so what we need to take into consideration is the internal resilient capacity of our countries. How can we respond in a way to take care of the welfare losses that occurred when the natural event happened, and then to get where we should have been had the natural event not occurred. And so we are on the global stage advocating that. Initially we called it the RDA, but we recognize that folks are very familiar with the MVI, and so we're seeing it as an enhancement to the MVI. But there's a critical reason why we need to do that too. Sorry, I'm going on this. But there's a critical reason, because initially when we started to challenge the per capita way of allocating resources, we thought that vulnerability was the criteria we should use. But that conversation has gone sideways. And so there isn't a country under the sun that can't claim some vulnerability or the other. And so we are saying, yes, we are all vulnerable. So the same storm that hit BVI hit Florida. But how long is it going to take us to recover in the BVI? How long is it going to take us to recover those welfare losses? And how long is it going to take us to get where BVI should have been had the event not occurred? And so that is why we are promoting this new tool that we think that should be taken into consideration in determining the flow of funds to our region. I wanted to say something else, Barry, that is kind of controversial. I said before that the MDBs recognize that our balance sheets alone won't be enough to crowd in the type of climate financing that is needed for our region. And so we have to find ways of crowding in private capital, mobilizing private resources. Cheryl spoke about it in terms of the philanthropies and so on. But the point I want to make is that we now need to challenge the old notion of profit maximization for the private sector. Does that model still hold? Or is it that the private sector now, that they recognize the existential threats facing all of us, prefer regulatory predictability and stability as opposed to trying to maximize profit in the short term? We need to peel that onion, and we need to understand it better before we operate on the old models. And I think that is one of the things that we need to do and understand better if we have to crowd in private sector resources, because if we're making the wrong assumptions, then clearly we are not going to hit the mark. There are a lot more I could say, but I want to stay there for now.
Thank you, Isaac. I mean, to your last point, I would just say ask any shareholder and ask the shareholders about the profit maximization model, see whether they agree with you or not. But yeah, the point you made about the partnerships, I think, is quite critical, because if we're really able to have make an impact, as all the panelists have mentioned, to help the most vulnerable, we really need to have genuine partnerships. Yeah. And I know, Isaac, just to stay with you again a little bit, we heard a lot about what the MDBs can and should do, but what about some of the other stakeholders? For example, the very countries that we speak about providing adequate, affordable financing and accessible financing for countries have an important role to play in scaling up finance flows and the sort of investments that may be needed. So just give us maybe one or two recommendations that you think the countries in the region, I should say, could do to help facilitate that a little more ease of the flow. Let's put it like that. So let's switch it a little bit and see, maybe give us a couple of recommendations, what you think the countries can do to help themselves, as well as we've heard Stephen talk about interventions, we've heard Cheryl talk about intervention, we've heard Minister talk about needs. So what do you think in that?
That's a good question, Valerie. So the same point about collaboration I made among the MDBs is the same point that holds for our borrowing member countries. And I heard that coming out clearly in the previous session, where we need to collaborate better. Cheryl made the point that the only way we could get scale is if we collaborate. And so we have to look more to regional public goods, to finance regional public goods where we have scale and where we collaborate. That is critical. Now, that conversation has gained ground at the highest level. So yesterday there was a panel with Prime Minister Motley, Secretary General of CARICOM, Minister Clark of Jamaica, the head of EIB, the president of CDB, and they identified 3 big ticket items that could form the nucleus of that kind of collaboration on regional goods. One is connectivity, the other is the implementation deficit, and the third one, oh God, it's gone out of my head. But there is adequate scope for us to collaborate at that level. The other point I want to make, Valerie, to your question, is that countries need to use the resources available to them in a more strategic way, so that you do not try to use high-cost funding for climate-related events. Climate-related events, projects, clearly, we have to de-risk. Yeah, are you hearing me though? Something went...
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so with climate-related type projects, we need to rely more on concessional and low-cost funding, which the countries need to be strategic in terms of how they make those investments. And whilst I say that, though, I need to go back to the previous session where I think that we also need to look at the cost of capital and also look at other ways in which we could provide headroom for countries to have access to other resources, because cash liquidity is not the issue, it is the cost of money that is the issue. And so we need to look to guarantees and those sort of things to create headroom so that countries could have greater access to funding. But I think the strategic use of the available resources is something that I would advocate for BMCs.
Okay, thank you very much, Isaac. And I would like to ask Minister Gums to briefly comment on your the points that you made in terms of what countries can do, as a representative of a vulnerable country in the Caribbean. Like, what are your perspectives and recommendations, having regard to or not regard to the comments by the Vice President Operation? Thanks.
I wonder if I should agree. What I want to do is go back a little bit to the MVI conversation, because I think a missing part of the conversation is state identity, because state identity speaks directly to power and a country's power too, whether it is to access, to advocate on its own behalf when there is a climatic event. So, for example, there are certain countries with more power and access to media, and they can better sell their stories than others. So when we speak about vulnerability, if state identity and power aren't properly examined, then you'll have countries with everything else similar, looking as if they're the same, but when it comes to the power to act, the power to speak, the power to access, you then realize that there are barriers that weren't considered and are major elements of whether those countries are more or less vulnerable than the others. And so I'm not sure if it is included, but it is something that I have always thought should be very clear, because we really don't speak about state identity and power and how that makes a country more or less vulnerable. I don't know if you want to respond directly to that, because you seem like
it's a brilliant point, and we take it into consideration actually. You'll hear it in CDB where we tell folks from outside of the region that our region is not homogeneous. We have a lot of similarities, but we are also very different. And so there are some nuances in each country that we have to take into consideration. And as a matter of fact, that is at the very core of the implementation deficit challenge that we are taking on now, recognizing that it doesn't look the same in every country.
And I'm very happy to hear that. And in relation to your responses, have to go back to our status as overseas territories. We have had instances where we wanted to collaborate with other countries, and because of our status, we have been a burden to them in relation to accessing. So even though on paper, countries with similar requests or similar ambitions should collaborate, there's always some element of, beyond the paper, this doesn't actually make very much sense. And I don't know really how much of a role the banks in the region can play in supporting or leveling the playing field between countries, regardless of status. It doesn't always have to be status, but there are other reasons why. For example, you may have similar-sized countries with similar ambitions, but one is more of a risk than the other. And so, will I want to, if I was lower risk, to be associated with a high-risk country, and in that, am I now a liability to the country that I am partnering with? So there are some situations where we have to look into it a little bit deeper than having the similar ambitions and similar sizes to access financing. And the final point I think you are making on being smart about how you access financing, I think that's very important. Because I always feel that our climate response, and I mean that our direct response to climate change, should not be a business opportunity for any funding institution. We really should access as close to possible concessional financing. Thank you for being here, and I'm very sorry that you have to leave.
Yes, unfortunately, Stephen has another pressing appointment, so he has to leave. Yeah. Thanks, Stephen, very much for your participation. Yeah.
And I lost my point. But what I was ultimately stating is that when we access financing, it should take into consideration what is being financed. So I don't expect, realistically speaking, a solar project to be concessional financing, because then that can reap returns. Even when it relates to water, we would want, because water is very important, but you can sell the water. So even if it is a blended financing mechanism, we can make that case. But when countries are forced to dip into their critical reserves and also to increase their debt to respond to hurricanes or natural disasters, I think that is where we need that level of advocacy that says, in these such instances, and I am always a person of definitions, and I would love to see a scenario where it is clearly defined that all of our regional institutions can really insulate us by saying, we have agreed amongst ourselves that when it comes to these instances, we will not allow you to profit from these countries' pain. But however, if you would like to offer fit for purpose funding, then here are the thematic areas where you can now meet these countries where they are. And I think that is the kind of high-level advocacy we need from our leaders, when I say leaders, I'm talking about prime ministers, premiers, and such, but also the institutions such as the CDB and other institutions that manage the flow of finance to the region. Because until we have that clear demarcation of what we will and will not accept, we will have countries going into debt to respond to climate change when we have major development issues outstanding that we cannot access or respond to.
Thank you very much, Minister Gums. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. We're a little over time, but I would just take the prerogative of the moderator. If there's one question from the audience, anybody? Okay, thank you. Well, all that's left for me to do is to thank our panelists. I think we had a very useful and productive discussion with some practical views and some practical approaches, innovative as well, that I think we could take forward. And I hope the audience took some copious notes. And I think it's the benefit of this panel was that now Minister Gums will liaise with Cheryl to see what the opportunities from the brokering services of Climate Smart Accelerator.
Well, we already work together, and we have delivered on some really climate smart agricultural solutions in Anguilla.
Continue.
Continue.
As they continue to innovate, and of course, with the benefit of the actions of EIB and the CDB, I think we can have big impact as everyone is talking about. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, audience, for being here and staying with us. Thank you.